Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Leadership Where It Matters Most. Today's episode, I have as my guest Dr. Carrie Gress. Carrie is a fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center and a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. She has a doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America and the editor of the online women's magazine Theology of Home, which I'm sure many of my Catholic female listeners are familiar with. Carrie has appeared in numerous publications. She has written 10 books, numerous, countless articles. I think her work has been translated into 9 or 10 different languages. A lot of our conversation today is sort of around the themes from her latest book, which is called The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. We also make reference to her previous book called The Anti-Mary Exposed, Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. I joke with Carrie that I think she has some of the best book titles I've ever seen. So in today's conversation, we hear a little bit about her story, her testimony. We talk about what she felt was kind of missing from the work that she did in the Anti-Mary Exposed and how that informed and shaped The End of Woman. I think she discovered, to her surprise, essentially a lot of the dark elements in the roots of feminism. And we talk about some of the ideologies behind it. We talk about some of the main characters. We also talk about the influence of tragedy in their personal lives as it gave way into some of the thinking and the ideology with feminism from the beginning. Yeah, so we talk a lot about where the hope is for women's advocacy, just the inherent beauty and goodness and the reality of the gift of motherhood and family life. So once again, this was a very rich conversation. I think I could have asked her 1,000 other questions, and we had kind of a nice, edifying conversation even after the microphones were turned off, which I really, really appreciate. So enjoy this episode. Dr. Carrie Gress is a real gift of clarity and thought leadership for the church today. So enjoy it. Carrie Gress, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to be here.
I really look forward to this conversation, but before we get too much into all of your written work, which I would love to explore with you, why don't you just tell the listeners a little bit about Carrie Gress? Tell us some of your story.
Well, I'm originally from the state of Oregon, actually, and I grew up in a very secular environment. My parents were Catholic, but we weren't really practicing very much. And eventually, my father passed away when I was a teenager, and I think that really led me to ask much bigger, deeper, more important questions than most teenagers were asking. And that really led me back to the faith, things like suffering. Why do people have to suffer? Having watched my father die pretty quickly from cancer, but obviously a very painful death. Those are the kinds of things that you're asking when you're a teenager and I think beyond. And so the faith was really where I found a lot of answers and solace and clarity. Then I went to the University of Oregon and had more questions because of course, everyone around me was very secular and I just didn't know how to defend really any of the things that I believed in. And so I eventually made my way to first doing a master's degree at Steubenville in philosophy. And then finally I did a PhD at Catholic University of America. One thing led to another. And I finally figured out that I could actually write. So I have since written a dissertation and that was 300,000 words. So most of my other books have not been anywhere near that big. So it's been great to write, smaller books that are more manageable and a lot more reader friendly. I obviously have an academic degree, but I got married around the time that I was finishing up my degree and really was committed to the idea of staying home with my children. And so we do a lot of balancing in our family, but thanks be to God, I am able to be home with them almost all the time. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I have 5 kids and live in Virginia now.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, you have amassed quite a body of written work. I think it's 10 books, obviously just countless articles. Theology of Body, the online magazine, Theology of Home. Sorry, what did I call it? Theology of Body. Yeah. You introduced to the world Theology of the Body.
Yep.
Sorry.
No,
we are recording this on the feast day of St. John Paul II, so maybe that was
right.
a good slip up.
Good nod to him.
A nod to him. Oh, we miss him. So in I think it was 2019, you released The Anti-Mary Exposed, Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. And I believe it's 2023 when you published The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. First of all, I don't know who helps you with book titles, but these are amazing book titles. They really are. So
Oh, thank
kudos.
you. Thank you.
But I'm
Yeah.
curious, like after writing something so wonderful as The Anti-Mary Exposed, like what did you see as an author that was missing that would warrant another lit review, all kinds of research, and eventually writing The End of Woman?
That's a great question. When I wrote the Anti-Mary Exposed, and actually the titles, all of them have great stories behind them that maybe we can get into at some point. But the Anti-Mary Exposed, we didn't actually even know how to spell it first because we didn't know if it was hyphenated. It was just the word didn't exist. So that was pretty amazing
Yeah.
working with the publisher trying to figure out how do we spell it. But the thing about the Anti-Mary Exposed is it was so clearly directed at Catholics because of Our Lady at the center of it. And I just kept hearing over and over again from people, can you write something that I can give to Protestants? Can you write something that we can give to secular people, Jewish people, anybody? That was really what the goal was. And of course I couldn't just go back and like cut and paste the anti-Mary, and then just refigure it to a different audience. It just wasn't going to work. So I had to just really go back to the drawing board and figure out, what's the story that I haven't told? What are the pieces that I've been missing, and what is it that secular audiences need to hear? So that was was my starting point, but I didn't plan on the End of Woman being the book that it was. Partially because I really had, when I wrote the Anti-Mary Exposed, I really stopped my research in the 1960s. I went from the 1960s forward, partially because I just had always heard that first wave feminism was good, and I just didn't need to look into it. So when it was time to write The End of Woman, that's when I really decided, okay, I just have to go back and do my due diligence, take a look, see what's going on, in the midst of all of first wave feminism, and just really focus on that for a couple days. I thought it would take me a couple days to just look at the writings of people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And I thought, well, it's great. I'll get some good quotes that I can pepper the text with, and then just move back on to, the more second wave kind of content. And all of that just came to a screeching halt when I started digging into the first wave of feminism. My mind was blown. I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing there. And, so much of it was really gratefully because I wrote my dissertation on human rights. And so I knew well the whole French Revolution period. I knew the Romantic period. I knew, all of that era philosophically. So when I started looking at these early feminists, for everyone from Mary Wollstonecraft moving forward, there were glaring holes and serious issues that Catholics who are philosophers, you just can't miss. It's just so blatant that there was some real philosophical problems there. And so the more I looked, the more I realized, like, this has been kind of a train wreck since the very beginning. That's really when this pattern emerged, where I saw what we see in feminism today is really just a further expansion of what feminism already was, really in the early 1800s. I think that's when I've pinpointed the first kind of actual usage of the ideas that came to populate the term feminism. The term feminism didn't really congeal until about the early 1900s, but the ideas were already there, and that the concepts were already there floating around and being used pretty liberally. So anyway, that's really where the book just took on a life of its own when I started digging into that. And it was really intense too, because I was reading all of these books that, none of them were sympathetic to my point of view. All of them were very pro radical feminist works, including one book in particular called Satanic Feminism, which was a dissertation by a Swedish scholar published by Oxford University Press. So, this isn't some sort of fluffy occult kind of book. It took me a long time to figure out that this book author was actually very much for satanic feminism. He really saw Satanism as the way in which women's liberation happened. And it took me the longest time to really realize we were on opposing sides on the topic, because it was so kind of a sterile text. And then when I did, of course, I looked at the book in a whole new light. But that's really how the book came about, was, again, just wanting to really speak to a different audience, not just a bigger audience, but a much bigger scope is what the book ended up being.
Yeah. And I'm sure part of it, I think I've heard you talk about this, where, I think you had a hope that you would find maybe some virtue in first wave feminism, but it was quite shocking.
Oh, I was really looking for it. Yeah.
And in particular, there was three areas: the occult, this, free love kind of thing, and then the smashing the patriarchy. So can you just take listeners, maybe who haven't read it yet, they will after this podcast recording, but like, who are some of the main characters? What are some of the ideologies that really reveal how dark this was from the beginning?
Yeah. Okay. So the first piece that I figured out was that really the idea was that women's fertility is what makes women unhappy or causes suffering in women. And there are plenty of examples of this. This is just a reality. This isn't something that, I think is a bad thing that we acknowledge. I think it's a very good thing that we acknowledge it. But the way in which they wanted to sort of heal this or correct this was by making women more like men, instead of correcting it with, recognizing that fertility has and is an incredible gift. It was more like, how do we shut this off? How do we change this? So that was the first goal, was how, sort of fixing fertility. And you can see that moving forward through the 1800s, certainly the 1900s when Margaret Sanger arrives. I mean, this is her main goal, is to end women's fertility because the technology was developing along at that stage. But that's the goal. So how do they do that? Like, as you mentioned, there's these three pieces, three means through which they wanted to do it. The first one was this idea of smashing the patriarchy. What was this idea of like restructuring society? And all of these pieces are actually come together in the work of Percy Shelley, who is the English poet, romantic poet. He was very much influenced by his wife's parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Mary Wollstonecraft is actually probably better known now because she's always treated in like literature classes and things like that because there's so few women. So she ends up making it in. Godwin at the time actually was much more popular, much more famous, much more radical. He had been a Protestant pastor and really ended up influencing Marx. And he was very much against monogamy. He thought it was a kind of slavery for women. So these ideas came down to Percy Shelley, and he writes about this woman named Sithna, who was this kind of ideal woman in his mind because she's single, but she has kind of sexual independence, this free love idea. And she doesn't want anything to do with men. It's that smashing the patriarchy idea. And then has a relationship with almost nobody except the devil. So the occult piece is in there as well. And this became this kind of model for the women who were engaged in what was sort of proto-feminism, the kind of woman that they wanted to be. The really interesting thing, and I don't think I've said this on any podcasts yet, is that I was talking with my husband about this a few weeks ago because I was talking about these three pieces, and he was like, there's got to be an easier way to remember this. He started thinking about its connection with the Trinity. So he pointed out it's actually totally anti-Trinitarian because the first is smashing the patriarchy. Well, the patriarchy comes from God the Father. The second one is the free love part, which is, of course, the violation of the Holy Spirit in the temple of the body. And the third part being the occult, which is, of course, goes against the authority of Christ. So it's been a really interesting, mind blowing, because I always knew there were these three things. I just never had connected it up as a very anti-Trinitarian reality. But I think that's exactly what was going on and why those three pieces have been so consistent throughout the feminist movement. Even up till today, you can see them in spades. So anyway, that's really where it got started. And then it gets picked up by people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was very anti-Christian, very much involved in spiritualism and, seances, and also supporting people that were interested in free love, really this idea of changing the way men and women relate to each other in culture, that smashing the patriarchy idea, that's there. So that's kind of the 1800s, is all these ideas are just bubbling up. And then you fast forward to the early 1900s, and suddenly there's this like magnetic attraction between socialism and communism on one hand and feminism on the other. Initially, they had sort of been repulsed by each other. And then the communists and socialists realized how much traction they could get by manipulating the emotions of women, by telling women that they should be miserable, that they're unhappy, that their life would be so much better without children and husbands. And if they were workers, that's the big thing, of course, because the communists were so focused on this notion of work. And so the worker piece ends up becoming the real locus of feminism in the early 1900s. You've got all these radical women in the early 1900s in Greenwich Village who are writing all of this stuff about the potential of woman. And, if we could only realize the potential of women without men, without children, what do we look like? And, these are the same questions Mary Wollstonecraft was asking 100 years prior. So the pattern, rolls on. And then finally you get to someone like Betty Friedan, who was very much a crypto communist. She hid her communist affiliations entirely. But her whole book, The Feminine Mystique, is really about trying to get women into the workplace and get them out of the comfortable concentration camp, which is the home,
Mm.
and moved out into work, and really makes the argument based on a lot of psychology, things like the fear of missing out and, all of that kind of manipulation that she uses and used to try and get women to just really believe that they would be happiest if they just worked, they didn't have husbands and children. And that's really what I think we've been living with and what we see now. And it's pretty remarkable when you see all of these pieces come together, because suddenly the abortion movement makes so much sense. And this is how women have been really groomed to believe that their children are an obstacle to their happiness,
Mm.
and how we've gotten to this point where women are so open to the and forcefully open to the idea of abortion, because we've been so indoctrinated into believing that work is really where we're going to be the happiest and not really anywhere else. So that's really I think the biggest, this whole set of lies that kind of coming together. But, we can see the fruit of it undermining the family, undermining the faith, and even undermining women. I mean, this is the hardest part, is just saying none of the data shows that women are happier because of this. Feminism has not made women happier. It's made them more medicated and more miserable. But it's certainly not bearing the fruit that, women are promised from it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, it's like a 10-minute summary of all that you've shared and all the research that's gone on. And I'm sure it's shocking to some people to hear about, the occult as part of the roots of feminism. And yet your research is very clear. It is crystal clear on this point. One of the things that you've also spoken about is just the role of tragedy. Some of the leading characters that you've mentioned, they have, they experienced horrific things. What is the role of tragedy and perhaps an incorrect response to those tragedies in their personal lives? What role does that play in this as this all unfolded?
So this is a really interesting topic, and I wish I had more or psychological background. And I've learned an awful lot through this about psychology and just the way the mind works and whatnot. Starting back from Mary Wollstonecraft, you can see right away that this is a woman who had horrible parents. That it's just an incredibly awful example of what a mother and father ought to be. You had this very abusive, alcoholic father. There's this horrible story about the dad hanging the dog
Mm.
one day. Like, he got mad and he just killed the dog, and beating his wife. And just awful. And the wife was not a great model of womanhood either. And so it's this kind of reality that, is imprinted. And you see this through all these women. There's various stages of abuse, there's trauma, all kinds of things that have happened with most of these women throughout their lives, or at different stages of their lives. And the reaction invariably isn't, well, this is my parents are a bad example, or this is something that, happened to me that is a one-off, or doesn't mean that all men are bad. But the reaction is, parents are bad. And you can see this in Mary Wollstonecraft's work. In particular, she's got some novels where in the novel she speaks about this kind of ideal of free love, of getting out of monogamy, and how that's really where the best relationships will be, and that's where children will be cared for. And again, this is the same idea is reverberated back in the early 1900s by other women. This belief that if we just didn't have the confines and the constrictures of marriage, then everything would sort of fall into place in a beautiful way and people wouldn't be so damaged.
Mm.
So this is the hard reality, is it's sort of this brokenness leads to a real misguided sense of what it is we ought to do to correct these problems. And of course, it's the idea is all men are bad. We need to get rid of men. We need to get rid of hierarchy. We need to get rid of the church. We need to get rid of the army. We need to get rid of any kind of elements that are created by, the genius of men, so to speak, and just collapse everything down into a very egalitarian reality. And, it's really communism. It's a proto ideas behind socialism, communism, where people are all equal. No one's above. Men and women are interchangeable. All those ideas really started there. But yeah, it's just this time and again, it's the exact same reaction of these broken women, attracted to these bad ideas that they think will liberate them. And of course, they just end up creating and wreaking more havoc in their lives, because their relationships and the kind of no bonds, no monogamy, no commitments, all of that is just, is a disaster. So yeah, it's really sad to about these women's lives and see what's happened, has happened to so many of them.
I wasn't going to talk about this, but it's just coming to mind. So I want to get your opinion and perspective on this because, when you fast forward to the culture and society that we see today, And you see something like, for example, just the consistent reality of anxiety and depression, especially with young people. And you wonder, like, what is the cause of this? And, you know, beauty will save the world. And one of the aspects of beauty that's saving the world is just the marriage covenant and the beauty of family life well lived, and how that's an antidote to the real issue of anxiety. And yet we externalize these things and we start talking about the economy and all these kinds of things. But, you know, the church is the expert of humanity. And one of the things we have always honored and loved and appreciated and held up with such high regard is the family. You know, the roots of these things come from broken families and the abuse and all the rest of it. And so much of that is just carried out today and yet manifesting in different ways, how we respond to this. Make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic point, because the reality is that people need a mother and a father that love them and are dialed into them and dialed into their needs. And so all we've actually done is exacerbate the problems that come from children who are not well attached to their parents. They don't know what it looks like to be a father. They don't know what it looks like to be a mother. I've talked about this a lot, this idea of this craving that people have for maternal love.
Mm.
It's non-sexual, it's non-threatening, it builds you up. I mean, there's something very, very special about the love of mother. And that's not to denigrate the father at all. But I think this is what, if we're going to talk about feminism, this is really where the break and the problems are created, because women aren't there to be mothers, to love their children in the way in which they're really needed. And this is not to say, people always accuse me of saying that women ought not to work, and I always think it's kind of funny because I'm clearly working mother. But I think that it's just really important, that balance of recognizing the needs of our children and what we're passing down when we do not mother our children the way in which they need to be mothered. And it's fantastic to see, there's research being done. I'm sure you've seen the work of Erica Commissar, who's a Jewish, I think she's a psychotherapist, on attachment and, all the requirements that children have to be well attached. And then, of course, there's all the research showing, Brad Wilcox is great on this, of course, of what happens when you've got two parents and children and they're well attached. Just the potential for happiness can happen because the starting place was good soil. It was a good place for the child to really understand what it means to be loved, and then therefore able to go out into the world. And so if you do not have that from the beginning, of course it's going to be scary to go out into the world if you don't know who you are, you're not rooted in any kind of real love or sense of identity. All of those things are going to really be exacerbated. And we're now on the third or fourth generation of children who weren't parented well.
Yeah.
I think this is what we're seeing, this mental health crisis. All of these things could be very simply solved by just recognizing that how important motherhood is, and what an incredible gift it is to be able to form the next generation. And this is really where the problem of the idol of work is what creates the problem, because it's very hard to do both. It's very hard to mother people and to work full time and just get it all done in a way that needs to happen. And I think the more we can press into the importance of motherhood, then a lot of these problems will dissolve themselves. But that's the big thing, is for 50 years, we haven't said one good thing about motherhood in the culture.
Mm.
It's always been the opposite, that kind of you go girl culture and that focus on career, and not really recognizing the importance of those really thick and important relationships that our culture depends on for flourishing.
Yeah. Now, I mean, you don't necessarily write with the intention of speaking to men as often as you do to women, which is beautiful and good. But one of the things that just struck me, Carrie, is that, this notion from the beginning that it wasn't advocating for women and for them to have opportunities that men have, but it's this sameness of men, that they'd be the same as men. And there's almost like there's a seeping into, I would propose there might even be a seeping into, maybe not in the same diabolical way, but a sameness even for men, that men who are good Christian men are kind and nice and forgiving and all these things. And yes, they are, but there's a complementarity that allows them to be distinct. And even last night, my wife and I were having a conversation with our teenage son, and how she approached it and how I approached it was completely different. But it was beautiful, and I think beneficial to my boy who's, dealing with something. And there's just this complementarity that is just so good. And yet this sameness is trying to wreak havoc against that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And, that's been actually one of the most interesting things about this book, is that the response that I have gotten from men, I did well over 100 interviews in the first few weeks when the book came out, and a lot of like talk radio, and it was just pretty amazing. At one point, one of the interviewers said, "We need you. Where have you been?"
Mm.
And it was just great because I wasn't attacking men, and I was trying to help them understand how the culture has gone to this place. I mean, obviously men and women, but I think that these books have allowed men to not feel shame or guilt and allow them to kind of see the problem in an objective way. And I've seen this in my talks too, just body language change of people when they start thinking about this in terms of this, women aren't awful because we want to be awful. It's because this is how we've been trained. This is what we've gotten, with our mother's milk, was this idea of beating the boys and whatnot. And so we don't have that compassion isn't always there, but we also don't recognize the way in which feminism really silences men. Very few men want to argue with women. Very few men want to, in any way, engage in a dialogue about feminism with women and feel like they're going to, it feels like kind of unwinnable.
Yeah.
So I think it's been great for both men and women to have these conversations. I know a lot of couples that have actually read the book together, and it's borne a lot of fruit because, and I know even just in my own marriage, trying to not be, domineering about certain things that I was kind of blithely unaware of. But, my husband at just certain points won't say something because he knows I'll be upset about it. And that was not what I wanted for my own marriage. I wanted to be able to discuss these things in a way that, my emotions aren't going to like trump the whole conversation. And so I think that's really part of the healing. It's almost like we've been in this really bad divorce that's been going on between men and women for a long time, and so many women are rallying around the women and so many men are rallying around the men in very unhealthy ways. But the important thing is to recognize that we have to have this complementarity. We have to be able to communicate with one another and figure out how to do that in a way that's fruitful and constructive. And as you mentioned about you and your wife, it's still different but incredibly useful for our children, and then even outside the home as well. So I think that that's a really important aspect that has to be there when we're talking about these issues, is kind of a charity for both sexes instead of just kind of this railing against one or the other two is really important.
So I want to ask a question, and I know this isn't original to me, but I'd like to get your response, because some women who are listening might be thinking to themselves, like Dr. Carrie Gress, who has had the opportunity to get an advanced degree, who's had the opportunity, to launch a successful business enterprise. And those opportunities are the harvesting of all the hard work of feminism that's gone before you. How can how dare you kind of thing speak about the introduction of feminism into the world from this dark, kind of lens? Like, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think the first thing is just to recognize, like, who would ask that question about any other area? Like, this is a fascinating thing to me, that how taboo it is to be able to question feminism. I mean, we would never say you can't question the church, you can't question the government, you can't question it. This just is not at all part of our culture. And so it's always this amazing dynamic to me that somehow appropriate for people to think that I shouldn't be able to question this thing from which I've benefited. So I think that's the starting place, is to really say, look at the data. Is this helping women? Is this, what's it doing? But as far as, my degree and work and whatnot, obviously I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunities that I've had. But the amazing thing too is to just start looking back at the history of the movement and just to see how so much of it actually wasn't really feminism per se. It was actually things like industrialization, which gave people more cash in their pockets. So suddenly schools are available to women in a way that they weren't before, because no family could afford to educate their daughters as well as their sons, because they need their daughters at home. Like, all of these major changes that have happened in technology, I think have actually done a lot more for women, which of course has been developed mostly by men, than feminism itself. I mean, it just, the huge changes in education and opening it up to women, all of that was already starting in the 1800s and happening because of this increase in economic terms. And then, of course, there's things like washer and dryer.
Mm-hmm.
I know that most of my life I can, accommodate the needs of my family because I have a washer and dryer. I have two sons that I load it and they take it from there, make sure it gets through the process, and then I fold it and everybody puts them away. It's at the dishwasher, it's, food delivery, it's frozen food, it's, it's even the car that I drive, all of these things that we have at our disposal that allow us to have free time in a way that we obviously wouldn't 100 years ago if we were out, going to our garden to prepare for winter. And, grocery stores didn't even exist the way that we know them today until about the 40s. So anyway, I think that question it just starts from it's a wrong starting point, because all it really does is protect feminists that are promoting ideas that are actually really damaging to women, I think, and damaging to society and culture and beyond. So many of us have think that way and have thought that way, and I know I even thought that way for a long time until I started really realizing, like, how come there's this taboo that I can't look behind the curtain, so to speak, and really see what's actually going beyond, but I have to feel so indebted to it.
Mm,
We would never think that that's healthy in any other context. So I
yeah.
think it's certainly healthy here too to start bringing these things out.
It's interesting because as you were going through some of the lists, like technological advances and all those kinds of things, the first person that I actually saw address sort of this disproportionate appreciation for feminism that has led to, many opportunities for women in the modern world was actually Jordan Peterson. And I thought, oh boy, like there's a part of me that was thinking, how dare you as a man speak to all these things? And I'm like, wait a second, have I drank the Kool-Aid? Like, of course, why can't we just objectively talk about the multiple things that have led to, the opportunities that women have? So thank you for sharing that. I think that's really important.
Just to pick up on Jordan Peterson, one point that I've heard him say that I think is just genius too is just the irony of the fact that feminism has really started out with this very anti-hierarchical vision, and yet most women are aspiring to work in a very hierarchical, corporate ladder,
Yeah,
and willing to give up so much of their time, money, energy, and life for that corporate ladder. So yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which we can look at this with it from a much healthier and balanced perspective, for sure.
absolutely. And again, that just kind of seems to be rooted in this false notion of sameness, right? That if we want to honor the dignity of women, let's talk about what they bring naturally, which is so many important things, let alone pursuing C-suite and all the rest of it, which they're obviously capable of doing. Nobody would deny that. I want to present a situation to you and get your perspective on this. So I have a long-term friend who is very successful in her career. And she made the observation to me a few weeks ago that really struck me. And I'm curious what you think about it. And essentially, the essence of what she said was that what she's noticed kind of in corporate world is that women are typically promoted based on the accomplishments that they've already done to date. Whereas sometimes men are promoted based on the potential they have in the future. Now, I can't empirically tell you whether that's true or not, but that's kind of her observation. And I thought, that's interesting, and gave me pause. Now, I present to you that as a situation, but I'm just wondering, what are the things that we should be advocating for if we want to support the equal dignity of women? Is it things like what my friend issued as an injustice? Or is it more things about, can we talk about the inherent beauty and genius and contribution of women that maybe isn't in the corporate world? This is a really sincere question, Carrie, because we all want to be, voices of truth and helpful in these areas. So what's the primary work that we have to do right now?
Right. Two parts. First, I'm really curious about that. And I would love to have more examples or hear more from your friend about what exactly she means,
Mm,
partially because I haven't spent any time in the corporate world. I've spent all my time in academics, and I live around Washington, D.C., so it's all federal government. So what I see is entirely different. I see box checking. I see women getting jobs because
mm,
they're women. I see women getting, I have a female owned business. We have benefits that come because of that. And I also have a degree in philosophy. I think other than physics, that's the only field that has fewer female to male ratio. Philosophy is second in terms of the fewer women. So if I actually wanted to go get an academic career, I could probably get a job very, very quickly
yeah.
as a philosopher. But, there's something incredibly unsatisfying about that. Like, I would like to be hired on my merits and not on because I check a appropriate, DEI kind of box for people. And that's the other thing that, I just see in spades is the DEI hire kind of thing, which doesn't feel I think that sort of undermines your confidence. Like, was I just hired because I was a woman and they needed or did I really have what it takes to do this job well? So anyway, I think it would be really interesting to look more into that corporate reality, because I just don't have enough experience to speak to what your friend pointed out. But I think the easiest and, the simplest thing that we can do is we can really start helping women understand that fundamentally they were made to be mothers. That sounds really radical the way I'm saying it, but if you look at motherhood more than just biological motherhood, if you look at it sort of from the aspect of what a mother does, well, she nurtures others, she shelters others, she helps them see themselves better. She, all the things that mothers do to build people up into the people that they're help them become the person that they're meant to become. That desire and instinct starts from a very young age in girls. We see little girls playing with dolls. I have 2 daughters and 3 sons, so I know well the distinction between the sexes. They're not something that, they're the same. There's very clear differences between my sons and daughters, and that desire in little girls to mother others, happens early, and I think it gets sort of rubbed out of us very, very quickly. But if we could sort of pull some of that back in, and this is the beauty of the Catholic Church, is we have all these incredible examples of women religious who never had children, but who were amazing spiritual mothers to others. If we can press back into that and help women understand this isn't about power and control. The world wants us to think of ourselves in terms of power, control, ambition, competition. But what we're really made for is our compassion, our empathy, our that rich and thick relationship that we have with others, where we see what they need, even sometimes before they know that they need it. We can anticipate their needs. We can help them. These are not things that are limited just to the home. They can be displayed very, very easily in the church and in our workplaces and all of that. So it feels like a pretty easy shift if we can start helping women really understand what it is that they're made for. And this is where our fulfillment comes from, is, it's not just the accolades, it's these thick relationships. And, we see this desire very, very clearly in the pet population that has exploded. There's now in the States, people have more pets than children. We've got $700 million is spent annually on pet costumes. Women have to mother something. There's a sign I just passed the other day that said "Support Plant Parenthood" in front of a garden shop.
Oh my!
That's the next thing, is parenting a plant. So the desire is there. It's just a matter of helping women really understand what that is, and to funnel it in a way that's not like the devouring mother. There's something really distorted and controlling. One of the amazing things that I found in my research was this graph in it's actually a Jungian book that I ran across. Eric Naumann is the author of it. And it's this chart that shows all of these women throughout history, including the Virgin Mother, all the goddesses and gods. And it shows where they are in terms of good mothers and bad mothers. It struck me because there was no one left off of it because they didn't have biological children. They were all on it in one form or another. And it just really amazed me, because I suddenly thought, we can't get out of this. We can't get out of being a mother. We're just either a really bad one or we're a good one, or we're not so good, but we're still somewhere on that chart and graph, the way that we treat others and the way that we obviously treat our own offspring, but the people around us. So that was pretty amazing moment for me to really realize that this is just so deeply embedded into us, and it's we need to cooperate with that rather than fight or suppress it to try to be something that we're not, because that's really where the problems are coming from.
I mean, obviously, I think you're dropping a lot of wisdom, even going back to the Anti-Mary, because of the role of motherhood and all the rest of it. Quoting Jordan Peterson again, we're on a Jordan Peterson kick here, but good Canadian man. He has been speaking more recently about, against obviously this notion that, power is the story of the West, and we have to find where there's an imbalanced power and injustice power and all that. And he says the real story in the West is the story of sacrifice. That's what the West is being called to, is to this idea of sacrifice. And he actually says the Madonna is the perfect archetype. It's the perfect illustration and example of sacrifice. And he would even see the Pieta specifically, because you see the sacrifice of Christ himself. He's already dead after the crucifixion, but you see the mother, not a doting mother, but a mother that is willing to let the child pursue what he needs to pursue, even when it causes suffering to that child. So he's proposing that sacrifice is really the story that we need to get to. And there's something just beautiful and compelling and inspiring about that.
It is. It's really, and I've heard him add also too, just that's really how you build a civilization is through sacrifice, not through the grasping. And of course, we see this grasping, the narcissism, the mental illness side of things where people are pulling things to themselves instead of giving of themselves. And that's obviously where the unhappiness is. But yeah, I think that's just brilliant and makes so much sense is that idea of serving others. I was reading even just yesterday about how sanctity is the genius of loving others, the kind of specific genius in loving others. And I might have gotten that quote wrong, but in any event, that just, oh no, it was Carol Houselander. That's who it was. She's the one that mentioned that it's your genius in loving others, through your sanctity. And that all comes through service and self-gift and that sense of who you are. That's where your joy comes from, but also there's no sense of being unfulfilled in that experience as the fulfillment is already there. So yeah, I think it's the sacrifice piece is really key.
I've spent quite a bit of time sort of in the ministry to men space. And one of the things helping men overcome is just this inherent shame that is upon them for, toxic masculinity and all these stupid things that are being promoted these days. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the men, Carrie, that are listening to this who have daughters, because that's an area where a lot of men they're not comfortable in this space of raising daughters. Like, what is my role? What am I to call forth and forward from these beautiful children that I have? What would you say to, maybe young dads that are raising children? Some of them are girls. What can they do to communicate and elevate and honor their inherent dignity, even as little girls?
Yeah. I would say the first thing and the best thing you can do is really delight in them, to just let them know how much just their pure existence delights you and how important that is to you. And for them to see that kind of love, that's, they're not doing anything other than being who they are. And that's enough. I think that's incredibly important. I think the other thing that feels hugely important is to really work to protect their modesty and their innocence. This is the one area that I am just completely confounded by. And maybe you can answer this question better than I can. It looks like men surrender all of that to their wives. And as a result, young girls don't feel protected. They don't feel like they're being guarded, and they don't feel like they have a way forward in terms of navigating certainly the sexual world and all of that. And so they're first of all looking for that affirmation from a boy that they should have already gotten from their father, and that would imprint upon them what it is that they're looking for. They're not just looking for someone to affirm them, sexually, because they didn't get the affirmation at home. So anyway, I think that is a critical piece, but I think the bigger piece is really just the sense of, there's something really important about the dad with the shotgun on the front step, that there's a sense of, and you don't have to go that far, but there is a sense of, because that not only does that indicate to the young man that this girl is something precious, but more importantly, it indicates to her that she's something precious. And I think that this is what we're not being reminded of. Women are being commodified, just used as bodies. If we can communicate to young girls that there is something precious and there's something precious about their body that's not meant to be tossed to the world, I think that can go a long way. So yeah, there obviously are creative alternatives to the shotgun on the front porch, but I think that
My Canadian listeners are freaking out right now.
probably. But I think that there's a way that we can communicate that and instill that in our daughters, that fathers can do that in a way that mothers don't always do it, and that can affirm and even make a girl understand deeply, even if she doesn't always follow it, especially those teen years and college years that are so hard. It will come back to really resonate with her as she matures and gets older. So I think that's just key.
Yeah. It's interesting. You say, maybe you can speak to this with men, but unfortunately, I think one of the realities that is contributing to men not handling that kind of the modesty question, it's another ramification of the porn culture in which we live,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
so many men struggle with that addiction, or at least being exposed to it in their life. that sadly, there are very few things about sexuality that they do not deem with shame and regret and
Mm,
confusion and self-hate, like all these kinds of things. So to wade into that space, they feel fundamentally like hypocrites, and they don't,
yeah.
they're afraid to enter into it. Whereas it's such like men, that desire you have to protect and to honor the dignity is good, and step into it. That's what I would say to men, is to step into it, to meet it, and let that even be something that woos you out of that environment. But I'm sure that's one of the reasons that's keeping men silent on that issue, sadly.
And I'm really glad you brought that up because I think that is something that I've thought about, but I just couldn't confirm. But I hadn't really thought about the shame and the hypocrisy, those aspects being real emotional barriers to being a protective and dad. So yeah, I think that's really vital. But I think you're right. There is something about when these relationships become thicker, it's easier. The emotional pieces are filled so much more, and then it is easier to escape porn, or at least that's my understanding of it. And I think that's something to not take lightly at all. It's really key to get the whole relationship with the family ordered again, and there's just the fruit really abounds when we do.
Yeah, absolutely. We're nearing the end. I'm going to ask you the keep it real section, but I just want to pause and just say thank you, Carrie, for all that you've done, the body of work, all that you're endeavoring to do with Theology of Home. Like it is so good and so needed. I'm raising, 8 kids. We got 3 daughters. My oldest daughter just got married. So one of the gifts of appreciation at the bridal shower was the book, the first one, Theology of Home.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you, because I'm sure that requires a lot of courage and generosity and all kinds of things. None of us even know, but I just want to say thank you. Really.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. I really appreciate that. I really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
It takes a village to raise a child, and we got 8. It takes even more than that, and so thought leaders like yourself are just so important.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's nice to hear.
That's easy to do, so thank you. So keep it real section, Carrie. We give, particularly those who come on the podcast that are authors, that have a bit of a platform, some quote unquote celebrity in the Catholic space, just an opportunity to share with our listeners something that the Lord, that you can give testimony to, either a difficulty that you overcome by his grace, a season of suffering, some other obstacle, just an opportunity to connect with the listeners who may not be able to connect with you as authoring 10 books because they don't even know they can write a paragraph, but they can address and relate to maybe some of the difficulty and the suffering. So is there anything that comes to mind that you'd want to share with listeners?
Oh goodness, I think the one thing that jumps out really is just I had this season when my children were very small where I was really alone. I didn't have friends. I mean, it's just kind of ironic now when I think about it. If you're just thanking me for Theology of Home, really how there were amazing things happening in my home, but I didn't have any real emotional support or spiritual support. I felt very alienated from my parish. I was living in an area that was incredibly transient. And so I would make friends and then they would move away. And, I remember for years just thinking, I wish I had one friend whose house I could just go over to with my kids and just hang out for a couple of hours. Like I just didn't even have that one friend, and my family didn't live close by. And it was 7 years that happened. And I can really look back on it now and see that the Lord was really pruning me. And there was really a lot in it was great for my spiritual life and really learning to pray differently, because I also had, prior to that, I was, daily mass goer. I usually spent an hour in prayer. In addition to that, rosary. I had all my routine down. But of course, that all changed with my children and had to really be shifted in different ways. So I can see that God was doing that too. But I can also see how there was this real preparation. Even during that time, I was also finishing up my PhD and my dissertation, and
Mm.
I mean, that was just a disaster on a lot of levels. Most people, the PhD is really it's hard because you have to show that you can get through the research and you can write this and you can jump through all kind of the hoops of even things like finding library books and all the resources that you need for it. But most people don't have, children. Like I remember I had to go get a special stroller so I could take my infant to the library at University of Virginia because the stacks were so narrow and I couldn't get through
Mm.
to get the books. Another time I actually had to leave my daughter at the librarian's desk at Catholic U because the elevators were broken and there was no way to get her stroller through the stack. So, I mean, it was just crazy things like this that were all happening kind of simultaneously, but I can really see again that God was doing something very formative during that time. both with the suffering of the, understanding that lack, what happens when you don't have support, when you don't have community, when you don't have that village to help raise your family. Just, what are the things that we need as women to keep feeding us? And I think Theology of Home probably came out of that in a lot of ways. And then the other thing is just to see how, completing that dissertation, I even brought one of my kids to my defense because I was still nursing and I lived too far away to leave him home. How that dissertation has really led to my other books, because if I didn't know how to research that and all the work that was involved in that, I never would have written these books. So anyway, I guess it's just, that that richness of that desert, and really the fruit will be born of it, even though, of course, at the time it didn't feel like anything. There was never going to be any fruit, and it just felt interminable and really challenging. But it's a season for which I'm incredibly grateful, despite the fact that it was incredibly painful.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks for sharing that. The phrase, and I forget who said it, a saint, but that which is assumed has been redeemed, or only that which is assumed has been redeemed. And it's so comforting when we study the life of Christ. For Catholics, an appreciation of Our Lady, who had their own periods and seasons of feeling absolutely alone. My wife had a powerful encounter when she was in the Holy Land in the Church of the Annunciation. Just this moment of recognizing how alone and isolated Mary would have felt when the news first came, right? I mean, who do you share that with? Who else has had that experience, right? Like, nobody.
Right.
Yeah.
She's not texting anyone. You'll never guess what happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of that. And yet it's more words that, whenever we go through suffering, Jesus is just so close to us, and there's always grace there. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah. No. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. What is on the horizon for you? Are you writing another book right now?
Oh, goodness. Right now I have a couple of book ideas in mind, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. Where Theology of Home continues to grow and expand. So yeah, I've always got something sort of cooking, and I actually feel like more in my own skin when I have a book project happening. And that's really my first love is the writing. Hopefully I'll get something figured out soon, but the books that I'm looking at right now are kind of more of a Theology of Home type book. It'll be a different name and kind of a different direction, very heavily illustrated. I'm really feeling like that is an area that as Catholics we need to press into more, that kind of magazine, coffee table book style, that the images are incredibly important and communicate a lot. The book publishing world is challenging right now because everybody is, putting stuff online and people don't have attention spans and all of that. And just the success of Theology of Home 1, I think really tells me that this book, there's a lot more room for books like it. So I'm looking at that. Otherwise, I'm kind of at the stage. I have a 15-year-old and my youngest is 4, and I'm really just trying to be present to them in all the different ways in which they need, all 5 of them, and they're all in different sports and things like that too. So I'm able to spend a lot of time just being with them, and that's been really great. Feels like I could probably be doing a whole lot more, but it's just nice to be able to recognize that that's where I need to be right now instead of all over the place and neglecting them.
There's nothing more important than family. So that's awesome. Where do people find you online? Is Theology of Home the place to go? Theology of Home is great. They can also find me. I have a scholars page at Ethics and Public Policy Center. CarrieGress.com is also where I think my articles for the last 8 years or so are all cached there. So those are the best places. Wonderful. Carrie, again, thank you for all that you've done, all that you are, your presence in the world. We're better for it. And thanks for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. My pleasure. Thank you. Listeners, we will see you next episode.